Welcome to the Great Loop Radio podcast, brought to you by America's Great Loop Cruisers Association. We're dedicated to sharing Great Loop information and inspiration with those actively cruising, planning for, or dreaming about a Great Loop adventure. I'm Kim Russo. I'm the director of AGLCA. Today we're going to talk about safe boating courses and the fact that you do need one to do the Great Loop, to follow all the regulations along the Great Loop. There are more and more states along the Loop that are requiring a basic boater education course. So Robert Rice will join me today. If you're a regular listener, you will remember Robert. He has been here many times before to share some boating education with us, and he will be joining us. Before we bring him in, I do want to take a moment to recognize and thank our Admiral sponsors who support AGLCA at the highest level. They are Great Loop Yacht Sales, Passage Maker Trawler Fest, Skipper Bob Publications, and Waterway Guide Media. As always, we encourage our listeners and viewers to support these businesses that support the Great Loop. All right, let's dive right in. Rob Rice, thanks for joining me again.
Oh, I'm always happy to be here to visit.
Well, it is always a pleasure. And for those who maybe have not caught one of our episodes where you've joined us before, why don't you go ahead and just kind of introduce yourself?
Sure. I have been boating now for a while. I got deeply engaged in sailing through my daughter who joined the Girl Scout sailing program. And from there, I got bit by the boating bug. I teach sailing for that group. I hold sailing instructor qualifications, about 5 of them from the American Sailing Association. I'm a boating safety instructor for the U.S. Coast Guard through the part of the Coast Guard that I belong to, the Coast Guard Auxiliary. And I'm a boating safety instructor for Texas Parks and Wildlife, which is the regulatory agency here in my home state of Texas that looks after boating safety issues. So this is kind of my stuff. I teach these boating safety classes on a regular basis as well.
And you're also a looper. Tell us about your plans for your own Great Loop.
Yeah, so the screen grab behind me is our boat, which we bought, I don't know, 2 years ago, a little less now, which is a 2006 Endeavor Power Cat. Love the boat. I've done about 1,800 cruising miles in the boat myself, much of that down the Western River, so a good chunk of the loop route, and then westward from Mobile Bay across the Gulf ICW and to my home waters in just off of Galveston Bay in the Houston-Galveston area, and then some local cruising and local boating in the Texas Gulf Coast area. Our plan, well, we still have one kid in college. He's got another year and a half. Probably won't go until after he's done. It would be lovely if we could convince him to come home for a year or so, and we could leave the 80-pound German Shepherd with him. That would be fabulous. I don't know that that's going to work, but we'll try.
Yeah, there you go.
It's a little ways down the road for us yet.
Yeah. Well, so hopefully you'll be able to start that soon. But yeah, having somebody at home to take care of the home and the dog is always a great thing if you're not going to bring the dog with you.
That would be the simplest way to solve that.
Yeah, exactly. So we wanted to do this episode on the safe boating class requirements because it is a growing number of states that require this. We at AGLCA hope this is the absolute minimum members do to educate themselves about being on the water and before they leave for the Great Loop. Recently in the forum, this actually had a pretty spirited and discussion on how do you do this? What do you do in each state? It's really not all that complicated, but I think it's a great topic for us to cover. So let's start with, why? Why do loopers need a safe boating course at this point?
I would say there are two main reasons. One is legal and the other is practical. The practical answer is these boating safety classes are a basic introduction to all the main ideas you need to be thinking about to be a safer boater. And because loopers are looking at a 6,500-ish mile journey over a year, give or take some, you're on the water far more often and so exposed to more risks and hazards, and you need to be a better educated boater if you're going to do that journey. That's the practical reason. That's really why you should do it. The other reason is legal, and that is it looks like they're out of the U.S. There are, I think, 45 states that have some requirement for at least somebody to have a boater safety education class. Most of those states, it's a requirement based on the idea of everybody born on or after a specific date has to have a boating safety class. So, for example, in my home state of Texas, the rule is anybody born on or after September 1 of 1993 is required by law to have a basic boating safety class, the kind of thing we're talking about. The date cutoff or that date rule depends by state, and it varies kind of all over the place. There are 5 states, I think, that have no requirement at all. And out of the other 45, there are 3 states plus the District of Columbia, which require a boating safety class for all boaters of any age. And these requirements, the way they're worded, they apply to any boater inside their state waters, whether you're a state resident or not. So, and the 3 states, the District of Columbia plus 3 states, New Jersey, New York, and Virginia. So all of these are areas you either could easily or will definitely pass through in doing your loop journey. So the legal issue is it's required by law if you're going to travel across through the waters of DC, New Jersey, New York, or Virginia.
Yeah. And, DC, if you're not going to do the Potomac, you may not enter DC. The others are pretty hard to avoid on the Great
They're
Loop,
hard to avoid.
particularly New York. New Jersey, in theory, maybe you could go on the outside for most of that state. But the discussion really started, I believe it was just January 1st of this year, 2025, where it became all boaters of any age in the state of New York had to have this course. Before then, it was being phased in, based on your birth date. And, it kind of struck me as interesting when this was kind of a revelation to everybody that this was now needed, because it had already been needed for quite some time in New Jersey. I'm not sure when it started in Virginia. So it's really
Virginia
been
is relatively recent as well.
Yeah, but it's really been, a good bit of time since New Jersey implemented this, meaning that to do the loop, you really had to have this course. So regardless of how it's coming about, I'm glad that the word is getting out. And as I said, this really should be the minimum requirement for the Great Loop. But tell us a little bit about the curriculum, because a lot of the questions that we got when we put out word as of January 1st, New York had this requirement. A lot of the questions were, I took this course, will it count? Or I took that course, or I have this certification. So is there a standard here that we should be looking for?
There is. Every state has some state regulatory agency, which is their state boating law administrator, the responsibility for managing these boating law issues. There's a organization for the state boating law administrators called NASBLA, the National Association of State Boating Law Administrators. NASBLA has reached an agreement among all these state boating law administrators on a standard curriculum for a safe boating class. That's important because a NASBLA compliant safe boating law course is recognized in all states. And so as long as you have a safe boating course that is NASBLA compliant, then that card is going to be recognized in every state. Here in a little bit, I'll talk about 3 really easy ways to get, to find and then take one of these courses. All 3 of these are going to be NASBLA compliant and recognized should be recognized in all states.
Yeah, that'll be helpful because I'm sure that people are wondering how they can start doing that to prepare now.
And it's not hard to get a class. That's just a matter of getting started and getting it done. In terms of what's covered, what the curriculum looks like, your typical safe boating law boating course is it's a basic introduction to the main issues that people need to know to be a safer boater. This is driven in part by accident statistics. So the U.S. Coast Guard and the states keep accident statistics that tell us what are the primary issues that lead people to get into trouble on the water. And so the curriculum kind of responds to some of that as well as to sort of the obvious things that people need to know about. So the kinds of things that are covered in one of these courses are different types of life jackets, what are the life jacket requirements, what life jackets are suitable for what kinds of boating, Boating under the influence laws. The short version of that discussion is boating under the influence is exactly the same kind of criminal law problem as driving under the influence on the highway. Typically, it is exactly the same blood alcohol level cutoff. It has the same criminal penalties and results in people losing their driver's licenses and going to jail. It's the same, exact same problem. That's super important that people be focused on that. A very, very high percentage of boating accidents are the result of alcohol. The classes typically are going to cover minimum required safety equipment, and that's a pretty short list. It's a surprisingly short list, but you do need to know what the minimum required safety equipment is. If you're boarded by local law enforcement or boarded by the U.S. Coast Guard or the Canadian Coast Guard, this question about minimum required safety equipment is pretty important. It's one of the things they'll be looking at. The class will cover at least a basic overview of the navigation rules, that is the rules of the road. What's a stand-on vessel? What's a give-way vessel? How do you safely meet and pass? Which side of the markers do you go on? That kind of thing. Education about how to read aids to navigation, like buoys and markers. What do those mean, and which side do you pass a red one on? That kind of thing. How do you effectively use a marine VHF radio? The importance of knowing how to use that radio to call for help if you get into trouble. Float plans, a little less important for a looper, but certainly important for local boating. And then what to do to how to get help in an emergency. Things like how to find weather information, some reminders, basic concerns about hypothermia, bad weather in a boat, and the risk of carbon monoxide poisoning, which is kind of a particular risk in a boat. You have all these systems that produce exhaust, and so carbon monoxide poisoning is actually a risk in a boat. So those are the kinds of things that are covered in every boating safety course.
Yeah, and that's a lot of topics.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah,
So your typical class is going to an instructor-led in-person course, which is what I'm going to strongly suggest. Maybe I'm biased because I teach them that way, but I think they're more interesting, more engaging, and people come away from the class with a better experience and the opportunity to ask their own questions. Plus, there's always some hands-on component to an in-person class. That's really valuable. So your typical boating safety class in person is 1 day. So around here, we teach this as a 1 day Saturday class, usually a start time of 9 a.m. And we end up about 4 p.m.
And we, I'm sorry, go ahead, Rob.
No, you go first. You go first.
We typically have been able to offer this course at a day before our rendezvous starts. So it will be happening again
Right.
at our spring rendezvous. So the boating class will be May 1st, and then the event starts May 2nd. So yeah, if you are a looper and you have not done this yet, you can get it taken care of right there at the event. And you're right, Rob, it is a 1 day class in our situation. And, that is thanks to the Coast Guard Auxiliary there in Norfolk, who teaches the class for us. And if you pass the test, you do walk away with your NASBLA card that day.
Right.
So lots of opportunities to do this.
So the other way to do one of these classes is to do it as an online class. And that is certainly an option. I talked to people who have done that, and they found the online experience to be tedious at best. But it certainly is an option. It's certainly flexible, and it's easy to get it done. And so there's nothing wrong with doing it that way. I do think that people are going to have a better experience in a instructor-led class. One of the things we do in the classes we teach, my friends and I in the auxiliary here, is we get flares out and fire off flares. Your average recreational boater has absolutely no idea how to light a flare and what happens when you light a flare. And that's a pretty valuable experience. You're unlikely to need it, but if you do need it, you need to know how to handle it safely. That's the kind of thing you're going to get in instructor-led class that you can't get online.
Right. I also think we have a lot of people who are experienced boaters, um, and then opt towards the online class because they think they already know a lot of the material. But what would you say to that, Rob, for people
Yeah,
as
so
you've
my,
taught this
my
class so
experience,
many times? Yeah.
yeah, my experience is we frequently have people in our classes who have boating experience. Some of them many years worth. Some of them, um, have a background in other kinds of boating, like sailboating versus powerboating. We occasionally have people who have or used to have merchant mariner credentials issued by the U.S. Coast Guard. My experience is without fail, these people leave the class going, wow, I'd forgotten all about this, or I never knew that. And it may be basic stuff because this is a pretty basic orientation to the primary safety issues. But my experience is everybody comes away from one of these classes having learned something new and having found the experience useful.
Yeah. So a good refresher for all, even if you have been boating
Yep,
for a while. Just to kind
absolutely.
of set the expectation, Rob, is this type of class an opportunity for some hands-on instruction as well?
No. So these are the in-person one is a classroom course. So on land, it's ground school, if you will,
Hmm.
land school for boaters, but only the basic safety focused orientation. So it's not a hands-on class in boat handling skills. So no on the water instruction.
Okay. Let's take a quick break and play a message from one of our sponsors. When we come back, I want to talk about how to find a class, what's the best way to go about that. And then also talk about some of the little bit unusual circumstances that are really kind of loop specific as far as crossing borders and things like that. So we'll be back in a moment.
Good morning, loopers. Many of you are probably already cruising in southeastern waters, and that is where the Salty Southeast Cruisers Net focuses all of its efforts to help you enjoy your time on the water. So as you prepare for the next leg of your journey, and as your resource for accurate, timely, and useful information, we want to invite you to use and add your knowledge to the wealth of information that's available through the Cruisers Net in its directories for marinas, bridges, and anchorages, as well as the latest fuel prices in your area. Our mission of Cruisers Helping Cruisers, may we invite you to help those following in your wake by sharing with us your cruising experiences. Thank you. Have a great day.
Did you know that every mile of the Great Loop is covered by both the Waterway Guide and Skipper Bob? Use them to plan your Great Loop cruise and learn about the places you can visit. In the cockpit, important navigation info is always ready at your side, plus marina listings, anchorages, services, and so much more. Each Skipper Bob and Waterway Guide is updated yearly, and waterwayguide.com and skipperbob.net keep you current with navigation alerts, cruising news, fuel prices, and special deals. With the Waterway Guide and Skipper Bob at the helm, you'll always be on course. Order yours today at the AGLCA ship store at greatloop.org. Waterway Guide and Skipper Bob are proud sponsors at the Admiral level with AGLCA.
We're back on the Great Loop Radio podcast. My guest today is Robert Rice. Rob and I are chatting about a basic boating course. It is required by some of the states that you will go through on your Great Loop for anyone who is transiting the waters of that state, whether you're a state resident or not. So bottom line, you need this course to be legally doing the Great Loop, and it's a great idea to take one anyway. So tell us, Rob, what's the best way to go about finding a class, whether it's one near you or a reputable, credited online class?
So there are two nationwide organizations that teach these classes on a regular basis as in-person live classroom instructor-led courses. One is the group I'm associated with, U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary. We teach a course called Boat America. That's our version of the NASBLA common agreed on curriculum class. You can find that on the Coast Guard Auxiliary's website. You go to CGAUX, short for Coast Guard Auxiliary, cgaux.org, and look on the left side. There's a button towards the top that says Take a Boating Safety Class. You plug in your zip code, say you're looking for a Boat America class, and it will give you nearby classes, dates, and times. These classes are offered by the Coast Guard Auxiliary all over the place, more often if you're closer to water than if you're in the middle of a desert. But there are Coast Guard Auxiliary groups literally all over the country. So lots of options for when and where, and they're offered pretty frequently. So very likely in any reasonably populated area, you'll have a couple of choices every month for when you can take one of these instructor courses. The other one is another great boating organization, U.S. Power Squadron, branded America's Boating Club. They teach a class called America's Boating Course. It's also a NASBLA compliant course. And so the content of the Coast Guard Auxiliary one and the Power Squadron version are going to be very, very, very similar because everybody's working off the same agreed on curriculum approved by boating law administrators. You can go to the U.S. Power Squadron's website, search for a class, and similarly, they have a search for a class tool. Look for America's Boating Course in your area, and you'll get some options for local clubs that offer the course on a regular basis. So pretty easy. The third one, I would say, another option is if you noodle around in your state's regulatory agency, Fish and Game, Wildlife, whoever the game wardens are regulated by, that kind of agency, there may be some state courses offered either by folks who are actually game wardens, for example, or volunteers through their organization, their agency, who teach the class. That's also going to be a NASBLA compliant course. That will require a little more digging to turn up one in your area. Any of those are perfectly reasonable choices. There's going to be a small fee, regardless of who you take the course from. Some states charge a fee for issuing the certification card. Some states don't. Coast Guard and Auxiliary and Power Squadron are going to charge a small fee for the class. It's not a big expense. The other option would be to take an online course, and I can recommend Boat US has online education, including the state's safe boating law courses. So if you go to courses.boatus.org, courses.boatus.org, and look for state-specific boating safety courses, you can find a way to take an online course for almost all states. There are a few states, and I'm not sure why this is, but there are a couple of states for which the Boat US course is not a state-approved course, and I have no idea why that would be the case, but it says so up front. You could simply choose another state. The Boat US course is mostly free. In some states, there'll be a small charge, like if you took the Texas one. Texas Parks and Wildlife collects $11 to issue the boating certificate, the boating safe boater card. And so when you take the Boat US course, the class is free. You pay them, reimburse them $11 for the fee collected by the state of Texas. Lots of places it'll be free. So price is not really a barrier here.
Okay. So keeping in mind that part of the loop goes through Canada for most of our members, what about U.S. residents who are temporarily boating in Canada as part of their Great Loop? Are there any regulations for boating education that they have to?
Our Canadian friends are pretty clear about what the rules are, which I like. I like clarity. And the Canadian regulations are very clear that a non-resident, that is somebody who is not a Canadian resident, who is operating a non-Canadian boat, pleasure boat, who's in Canadian waters for less than 45 consecutive days, you're not required to comply with their Canadian specific regulations. You comply with your home regulations while you're visiting Canada. So, 45 days is probably sufficient for most loopers to make their transit through Canada. So it won't be an issue. And this applies both to boating safety classes as well as things like what is the required safety equipment you have to carry on board. So the thing I like about the Canadian rule is it's absolutely clear and definite. 45 days, 45 consecutive days. And it has to be a non-Canadian boat and a non-Canadian resident. So U.S. citizens operating their U.S. registered boat, traveling temporarily through Canada under 45 consecutive days, you're good to go with your home, complying with your home requirements.
And do you know, Robert, I know it's very clear for under 45 days, but if there's a U.S. boater who plans to stay in Canada for longer than that, any idea what the requirement might be at that point?
I don't actually know, and I did not turn up an answer to that. It may well be the case that you would then need, my reading of the regulations suggests that Canada might well say the answer is, okay, now you have to comply with the Canadian requirements.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah, so if you're a U.S. boater who
that's the
plans to stay
positive about it.
longer,
Yeah.
we can certainly do some additional due diligence.
Yeah, so there is a way. There's a similar online classes for a Canadian boater safety education course. Looks a lot like what you would do in the U.S. The rules are a little different, and there are some things about Canadian boating rules and regulations that are a little different than the U.S. But you could easily do a Canadian boater safety education course online.
Okay.
Boat US doesn't do it, but there are other organizations that do the Canadian specific one who are approved by Transport Canada, which is the Canadian regulatory agency with authority over sort of boating and maritime affairs.
And so let's look at the flip side of that equation. We've got lots of Canadian members and members coming from all over the world, really, at this point, who are going to be in the U.S. waters to do this trip. Is there any clear guidance for them, especially because we're dealing with so many different state boundaries?
Right. So unfortunately, it's not nearly as clear, say, for our Canadian friends who are coming to the U.S. There is a memorandum of understanding between the National Association of State Boating Law Administrators and Transport Canada that encourages, and that's the key word, encourages states to recognize Canadian boater safety education courses. It's called a pleasure craft operator card, typically in the Canadian system. But NASBLA doesn't make law. It can't require the states to do that. It encourages the states to recognize Canadian education in their statutes and regulations, but that requires the states to actually do that. In my look at the requirements for the loop states, I didn't find a single state that specifically referenced Canada as Canadian boater safety education as complying with the state requirement. That leaves me concerned that our Canadian friends, unfortunately, probably do need to have a U.S. NASBLA compliant boater safety education card to be properly compliant with U.S. law. The other thing that kind of concerns me as a practical matter is you get off in Virginia. How often is a Virginia game warden going to come across a Canadian border boater who shows him a Canadian pleasure craft operator card when he gets asked about boating safety education? And how likely are they to understand what that means? I think as a practical matter, they're unlikely to know what that means. I just think the better choice in terms of avoiding the risk of a ticket is go ahead and take a U.S. boater safety education course. You're going to find that the U.S. course is very similar to what you did to get your Canadian pleasure craft operator card. So it's not going to be a hard thing to do. And just go to the Boat US website, choose a state where there's no fee, and just do it online. Those online courses are going to take 6 hours, say. You can start and stop them at your convenience. So you don't have to do it all in one sitting. It would be a bit much to try to do it in one sitting. So, do it over a couple of days, but it's easy to go ahead and take that class and be in compliance, and you just don't have to worry about it. I think it's the same set of issues, maybe even more so if you're coming from some country other than Canada. And I would say the other thing that makes this whole question for non-US persons a little trickier is the boat US, a registered US boat. Well, if the boat is US registered, I think the odds of convincing state law enforcement that you don't have to comply with the regulatory requirements of the state in which that boat is registered are about zero.
Yeah, I think it's really just a better safe than sorry kind of,
absolutely.
it is a free or very low cost and a minimal time
Absolutely.
investment.
Yeah,
There's nothing you're doing wrong by having it. So why not
that's
just have
absolutely
it?
true.
That's
Absolutely true.
usually the way I look at these kind of gray areas on a lot of these boating regulations. One of the other questions we got a lot when we started putting out some of the information about New York a few months ago was people who had kind of, an advanced credential, whether it was a six-pack Coast Guard credential or a 50-ton, 100-ton master, whatever it might be. These are all considered more substantial education and experience than the basic boating safety course. But we consistently were getting the question, well, I have a six-pack in this state, will that count? Is it clear or unclear? I mean, common sense would say that would be
Actually,
fine, but what
it
is your
is.
take on it?
Yeah, so it's clear, but the answer is it all depends. This is a very lawyerly answer. It depends. You could get into trouble, but
We probably
because it
should
all
add that you
depends.
are a lawyer. I'm
Yeah,
not sure if we
that's
said that in
right.
your
So
intro.
I am a
So
damn lawyer. Yeah, here's the problem. So what counts as sufficient boater safety education is defined by state statute, state law. And the state statutes, the vast majority of them do not say anything at all about a Coast Guard issued merchant mariner credential like a six-pack OUPV or 50-ton license or anything like that. So the only thing it says is you have to have a NASBLA compliant boater safety education course if the requirement applies to you. Lots of states simply do not provide for that merchant mariner credential to satisfy the boater education requirement. A smaller number of states do specifically provide that a merchant mariner credential will do it. There are one or two states that probably almost certainly intended that, but they said it so badly it doesn't actually quite say that. There's one, I've forgotten what state, but one of them said you're exempt from requirement if you have a U.S. Coast Guard issued motorboat operator's permit. No such thing.
Mhm.
I'm sure they meant a merchant mariner credential, but they mangled the statute so badly it doesn't actually say that. But it's a function of what does the state statute actually say. And there absolutely are some states for which a merchant mariner credential will do it, but there is a good number of states for which only a NASBLA compliant or a state specific one offered by their fish and game department, whatever, will satisfy the requirement. Virginia has a really colorful one. Not only will the merchant mariner credential do it, but if you were in the Navy and were a surface warfare officer or an enlisted surface warfare specialist, basically ship driver category of jobs, then you're exempt from the whole thing entirely. Just kind of intriguing. That was the only one like that I came on. So unfortunately, the answer is, we're dealing with a whole bunch of individual states which define their own rules. And there are some states for which a merchant mariner credential will do it, but there are a lot for which a merchant mariner credential is not identified as a compliant boating safety education thing. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. The process of getting a Coast Guard issued merchant mariner credential involves way more study and testing and proof of hours on the water than anything remotely like what we do in a basic boating safety class. So it ought to, but it doesn't because it's up to the states, and most of the states don't actually say that it complies. So again, the safest thing is take the basic boater safety education class as a quick refresher, and then you're golden. The other thing that's great about the boater safety education class is it's a one and done requirement. So this is not something you have to redo every 5 years or 2 years, or it's do it once and it's good for life.
Right.
So not a big deal.
Yeah, and I think, Rob has taken the time to look at the statutes because his background makes it a little easier for him than the rest of us,
Right.
frankly,
Right.
to look at all those statutes. But nonetheless, I'm sure it still took you a good bit of time to compile all of this. So, one of our members, when the question came up in New York, would their 50-ton credential suffice?
Mhm.
They reached out to the state of New York, and even though the statute didn't say it, they did get an answer via email that said, yes, it would be fine. And that's wonderful. But the concern there is still what happens when you go to Virginia or what happens when you're in
Yeah,
Alabama. So,
and if it's not written into the statute, here's the thing that concerns me. So if it's not written into the statute or written in specifically to the regulations, but the state agency, a help desk says, oh, yeah, no problem. You get stopped by a game warden. Do they know that's supposed to be the answer? You get stopped by the county sheriff's marine unit. Do they know that's supposed to be the answer?
right.
And I suspect you might not necessarily get the same answer from local law enforcement that you're getting from the help desk at the Fish and Game Department, who's actually thought about this. And the problem is, it's just so easy to be fully in compliant, and the burden of getting there is so small.
Yeah, exactly. Spend the 6 to 8 hours. You'll probably
Yeah,
learn something, and then you can't go wrong from that point.
yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
One state we really haven't talked about, and I do just want to kind of throw out a lot of the states is that require education based on age, based on birth dates, are really kind of targeting younger people who may be a little more reckless than your average looper. And
Yeah,
sometimes that's a sliding scale that as time goes by, that age gets to, older and older citizens.
yeah.
Alabama, though, has probably one of the earliest birth dates that they're targeting with their law, and it just went
Mhm.
into effect back in October. Um, Tell us a little bit about that one because it will
Yeah,
affect
so
a good bit of
right.
loopers.
Yeah. So, I have some gray hair. I was born in 1959. Under the Alabama law, I would be required to have boater safety education because it's everybody born on or after April 28 of 1956. So that's pretty close to almost everybody who's likely to be out in a boat. Um, and that is a pretty common pattern to have a specific date, and everybody born on or after that date is required to comply. 56 is pretty early, into the 70s, 80s, or early 90s is common for the rest of the states. So, and it varies kind of all over the place
Yeah, so
for
for
what
many
that date is.
loopers, as we've said over and over again, you need this anyway, but for many loopers, you can kind of, for most of us, add Alabama as a state where you will be required to
Right.
potentially show it
Yeah.
to law enforcement if you happen to get
And this
boarded.
is, I think the pattern is fairly clear that we're going to see increasingly more states move to the all boaters regardless of age are required. That's what I expect to see happening across time. And certainly that's sort of the creeping slow effect of uh, stating a specific date, everybody born on or after that date is required, and sort of effectively means we have this creeping age limit, increasing band of people who then have to have the requirement. And the practical effect of doing the loop is you're going to go through states that require 100% of all boaters to have the class. So the effect for a looper is you need to have a basic boating safety education class if you're going to do the loop and be compliant. And it's an easy thing to get done, and it avoids the risk of getting a ticket if you get stopped and boarded by local law enforcement in one of the states that does require it for everybody.
That's 100% it. That's the message.
Yeah.
So if you're listening and you're doing the loop at any point in the future, add this to your planning list, add this to your preparations. Just get out and get it done because the courses are actually super interesting, even if you're early in the process and learning about boating, and they don't
And that's
expire.
really a
So
good
there's,
time to do it is
yep,
early in the process
yeah,
because it really is just a basic orientation to the fundamental safety issues. So I think having one of these classes before you cast off the dock lines and actually start the loop is a good thing. Before you
absolutely.
even buy the boat, absolutely yes.
Yeah.
You'll be better informed as you start looking at boats and thinking about boats if you've kind of had at least a little basic boating education. And this is just a springboard. I think people should have more boating education than just these basic classes. And there are options, of course, for getting other kinds of boating education. So this is not the be all end all, but it is the minimum legal requirement. And effectively for loopers, everybody needs to have one.
Well said, Robert. Thank you for joining me. Thanks for all of the research you
Absolutely.
did to prepare for this. But thanks for helping me get the word out about this because it's really an important topic.
Absolutely.
And thanks to everyone who's watched or listened today. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Great Loop Radio podcast. Until then, safe cruising.